This is Mark Movsesian. I'm the director of the Mattone Center for Law and Religion at St. John's, and this is another episode of Legal Spirits, our podcast series on cases and issues in law and religion. You can find past episodes archived on our website, lawandreligionforum.org, and also on streaming platforms like Spotify, Apple iTunes, and Google. And we really encourage you to subscribe so that you'll be alerted when new episodes become available. Well, in this episode, we're going to take a detour to discuss a 400-year-old text. It's a text that has resonated in American life, especially since historians rediscovered it in the middle of the 20th century. It appears at the start of many anthologies of American literature, and it remains important in our politics. Pretty much every president or presidential candidate since John Kennedy has quoted the text. It's especially linked with Ronald Reagan, who made it famous in the 1980s. I'm talking about John Winthrop's sermon called A Model of Christian Charity, which is dated 1630. Most people don't know it by that name, but they'll immediately recognize it by the famous image with which it concludes, that of America as a city upon a hill. And of course, that image is a biblical one going back to the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, city on a hill has become a shorthand in American politics for the image that we have of ourselves as an exceptional nation, a magnet for the brave and talented, a place that matters to the progress of liberty. It's a boast, really. But if you go back and read the essay, you see that Winthrop, a Puritan, didn't mean it that way. Winthrop had a very different understanding of what he hoped America would represent, a static, hierarchical society bound together by Christian love. And the essay is much more a warning than a boast. Well, I'm joined on this episode by historian Don Drakeman to discuss Winthrop's essay, what it meant at the time, and what it's come to mean today. Don is a distinguished research professor in the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government at Notre Dame. He's written numerous articles and several books on law, religion, and constitutional interpretation. In addition to Notre Dame, he's taught at Princeton University, and I'm proud to say he's been a guest here at St. John's Law School in the colloquium in law and religion that we offer for students. So Don, let me say welcome to Legal Spirits.
Thanks, Mark. It's great to join you.
Don, let's begin with the odd history of this text that I've been talking about. The essay, or sermon, I guess, came down to us in manuscript form with the notation that Winthrop wrote it on board the ship called Arbella on the way to Massachusetts Bay in 1630. One legend is he gave the sermon on board the ship, but there are only a couple of contemporaneous references to the sermon, and there's no record at all that Winthrop actually delivered it on the ship or anywhere else. And then it more or less disappeared until historians like Perry Miller rediscovered it in the middle of the 20th century. So it's a weird history. Can you fill us in on this a little bit?
Sure. As you pointed out, Winthrop's essay really became a central part of America's origin story only in the 20th century. And like most creation myths, part of it's true and part of it's less true. Winthrop did write it. Perhaps he wrote some of it on the Arbella, but there's no evidence he delivered it, as you pointed out, and neither Winthrop nor his fellow Puritans would have recognized it as a sermon, despite all the talk about Christian love and God and so on. In fact, historians have recently discovered that most of it, but not the famous part about the city on a hill, had been used by Winthrop in meetings with investors, even before anybody set sail for the New World. But then, of course, 20th century historians rediscovering the Puritans altogether, like Perry Miller, highlighted it. The city on a hill would be really resonant for people who were surging with this sense of American exceptionalism, and politicians like Ronald Reagan picked it up and ran with it. And the rest is history, or sort of history.
Well, by the way, that's really interesting that he had used part of this before. I guess it's sort of like a Bach cantata, right? I mean, there are so many of them, he just recycled it every now and then. So he had used this before, you're saying?
Yes, apparently a number of times. It's actually a phenomenon I'm familiar with. And so if I can digress and actually divert from my role here as historian to my role here as former entrepreneur. I was for many years a biotech entrepreneur, and I had to do basically what Winthrop had to do, which is to go out and find people who might invest in a new venture, who you could talk into a vision of what the future might look like if they were to put their money into it. You then had to recruit people to do it. In his case, he had to recruit ministers, he had to recruit people who would help with defense of the community. He had to make sure he had adequate people who knew how to build houses and so on. He had to figure out how to get there. And then when he got there, he had to figure out how to run it. And so what this is really is the first part of it is his pitch to investors and vision for them of what the community would look like. And the last bit, I've done this myself with my company. You take your investor pitch, then you turn around and say, now we're going to make this happen. We're going to do something special. We've got a mission. People are watching us and we got to deliver. It really felt familiar. And so both wearing my historian's hat and my entrepreneur's lab coat, I felt this was a fascinating text. So in any event, that's not how the world has seen it. We've seen it as a sermon. We've seen it as a triumphant bit of early Americana, but there's more to the story.
Well, that's fantastic. I must tell you, Don, I've done a lot of reading on this essay lately, and I never thought of it that way as sort of a pitch that you're making. That this is really value added in this podcast because I have not seen that discussed before, actually, that this was part of making a pitch for a new venture. But of course, that's what it was. It was the Massachusetts Bay Company. They were setting up a new venture in the New World. That's fascinating. Well, so Winthrop was a Puritan, and a model of Christian charity is, or at least until I just got this explanation now, I think most people thought of it as a Puritan lay sermon. So I think we should say something about the Puritans. They were a small group, but they had a very big impact. In fact, Tocqueville thought of them as America's point of departure. That's what he called them. So who were they, and what sort of society did they attempt to establish? Why have they had such an outsized influence in American culture?
Wow, that's a big question. Briefly, the Puritan movement started as part of the English Reformation. They were people who were members of the Church of England, and they were afraid that the Church of England had not gotten rid of enough Catholicism. They called themselves evangelicals or the godly. Other people called them Puritans, like we might say, don't be a purist kind of thing. And then they took on the name. So what had happened is Henry VIII, we all remember him, essentially did a hostile takeover of what was an up and running religious organization with lots of land and lots of personnel. And he didn't change very much. Many of the rites and ceremonies, the way they did their worship services, were very much like a Roman Catholic service. And a group of folks, particularly in and around Cambridge University, became very heavily influenced by John Calvin's approach to a much more simple Reformed Protestantism. And their view of worship in particular, which was, I have to say, worship was a big deal. You have to think about the 10 Commandments. And the first 4 of them are what your duty to God is, and it's basically to worship God. Then the rest of the commandments are what's your duty to each other, and we all know those. So worship loomed very large in the 17th century mind, and they thought it was being done wrong. There shouldn't be fancy vestments. There shouldn't be church organs playing, music. It ought to be much simpler. So they tried to convince people there, and they were on the outs, in this part of the 17th century. And so that leads us to what I'll call our Puritans, or the folks who came here. They came here for a lot of different reasons. Some of the people were in the group were the godly, the members of the church, and they're the ones we think of. But they also brought people who could build and do other fish and other things that the community needed. But the people who were calling the shots were the godly, and they wanted to create a godly community in which only church members would be able to vote. And to be a church member, you had to testify to your personal conversion experience. And they would quiz you in church about whether they believed your personal conversion experience. And then even if they believed you, you had to live a virtuous life to kind of prove that you had been one of the elect who God had chosen to save. So they were, one historian has called them visible saints. They wore their Puritanism and their virtuous behavior, on their sleeves. And they also believed in visible sinners who had to wear their visible sins. You remember the Scarlet Letter and Hester Prynne, who had to wear the A for adultery?
Yeah, of course.
Well, they had an alphabet of crimes, and drunks had to wear a D, and thieves had to wear a T. I don't know if this was the origin of the letter sweater, but in any event, after a rowdy weekend, you might see a number of people parading around with an alphabet of letters. On top of that, the general court, which is kind of the combination judiciary legislature, had a regular business in banishing people from the community for doing bad things, and they were sent out. They couldn't come back, and many of them, like Roger Williams, Ann Hutchinson, and so on, ended up in Rhode Island. But no, this was a very regimented community. So they've had, they had a big influence in their communities, and we've looked back at them, and we'll talk about it some more, I think, in the podcast. But they wanted the freedom in the New World to live that regimented, intolerant lifestyle.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess so Puritan was sort of an epithet even then, even in the 17th century. This was not necessarily a mark of distinction or prestige to be a Puritan.
No, and you could get persecuted for it if you said the wrong things in the wrong place. And eventually, in the middle of the century, the Puritans would do much better, ecclesiastically and politically. But right now, they were on the outs, and this was a chance for them to go, live the way they thought they should.
Okay, so that's really very important background. Let's get into the essay itself. So, and I should say, we recently read the essay in our law and religion reading group here at St. John's. And I told my students that you can really see that Winthrop had legal training because this essay follows standard IRAC form. We teach students in law school: issue, rule, application, conclusion. And that's kind of how it was. I should say also, the students were pretty divided about the essay and about Winthrop himself, actually. So anyway, he begins by stating the issue. And the issue, he says, is in a political community, there inevitably exist differences in wealth and status. And actually, you just mentioned that some of the people coming over were the godly and some of the people who are going to be building the houses for the godly and stuff like that. But Winthrop argues that these differences paradoxically can bind a community together and promote equality, since everyone will have to depend on everyone else and exercise Christian love. So this is a very communitarian, although it's quite static, a very communitarian model for society. And it's certainly not our model today, John. I mean, again, to quote Tocqueville, we are a nation of restless strivers. In fact, historians say the Puritan society in Massachusetts began to fall apart within a generation or two. So what happened to them?
Well, that's interesting. Just by the way, on your IRAC form, which I thought was really interesting, if the Puritans had been listening to a sermon, they would have expected a different form. Sermons always started with a text of scripture, and then they would follow doctrine, reason, and use. So not terribly far, but always, kind of in service of interpreting a piece of scripture.
So maybe we're wrong to think of this as a sermon. I mean, that's often the way it's described. You already said it's a pitch, it's a marketing pitch, but that's interesting. It would not have been understood as a sermon by Puritans at the time. They wouldn't have recognized it as such.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is just the way they talked. I mean, we think of it as a sermon because people don't talk about Christian charity and love and that kind of thing outside of a kind of specifically religious context. But for them, everything was a specifically religious context.
Interesting.
Anyway, to talk about the kind of the rich and the poor, and from the point of view of this being a pitch to investors, I think part of that was a kind of this isn't going to be the Pilgrims all over again. So the Pilgrims, the people who didn't really land at Plymouth Rock, but did land not far, they started out as a genuinely communitarian community where all land was held in common, and they were all supposed to work it together and take equal advantage of it. And that turned out to be an unmitigated disaster. And they eventually, after like 2 years, decided that they had to go to basically what we call private property. So investors would know that if you started out by saying no, everybody's going to be the same, it's going to hold everything in common, that was going to send them down the wrong path. Secondly, this idea of a community bonded together by mutual Christian love meant that there were really important duties that people had, as well as whatever limited number of rights they might have in the Puritan world. And I think these days, as we've become the restless strivers, and especially in the 20th century, people started getting very enthusiastic about rights and tended to forget about the fact that there are duties that go along with those rights. And finally, you're right, it started to fall apart by the third generation. And when I was a lawyer back in the pre-entrepreneurial days, I remember rotating through the Trusts and Estates department. And the first lesson they told us as junior associates was everything always falls apart in the third generation. That it just, different folks have different interests. It's a much more widely dispersed group. And the family no longer is kind of a unit run by a small group. So in Massachusetts Bay, this was exacerbated by their theology. So if you say you have to have a credible conversion experience to be a church member, and you had to be a church member to vote in political elections as well as in church elections, and to have your children baptized and thus brought into the church, you had to be a member. And of course, you wanted your children to join the church because that way they could be part of the political community and so on. Now, by and large, the folks who came with Winthrop had already had their conversion experience. That's why they picked things up and moved to the New World. And their children would be baptized as a matter of course because they were members of the church. But many of those baptized children in the second generation never had the requisite conversion experience. They took this stuff very seriously. And they were anxious and they wanted a conversion experience, but it didn't come. And so now they have children. They are active members, but not full members of the church. They participate in it, but they haven't had that conversion experience. They want their kids baptized. They're big believers in baptism. They're big believers in their kids. And so there was a big theological to-do about that because some wanted to be super purist Puritans, and others said, geez, these are our families, these are our communities, we've got to kind of embrace more people. And so eventually the church has said, okay. But then the question is, well, now what's the town going to say? Who votes? That became complicated. And so everything gets more complicated. Different places make different choices. And over time, these very intimate connections between the churches and the state governments tended to be, looser and looser. And to complicate matters, a lot of those original Puritans who came, around 1630, well, 10, 15 years later, things are a lot better for the Puritans in England. They go back. So a lot of what you might call the hardcore went back to England, and therefore you've got a more kind of, let's say, a diverse community, and you have a bunch of Puritan ministers who couldn't agree on the time of day. And so that leads to what you described, which is that the communities begin to kind of trickle off in other directions, and it's not the same thing as the initial community.
Yeah, it's hard to keep it together with these centrifugal forces. And I guess also in America, there's always the frontier beckoning, and you can always just leave and go someplace else. So, Don, now, we've talked about this a little bit. I mean, the only church members could vote and so on. And I think Puritans get a reputation sometimes as being theocrats, but they weren't really theocrats, were they? I mean, given the standards of the time, that's we're sort of being anachronistic to tar them with that, right? They weren't really theocrats, were they, Don?
Yeah, so it really does depend on your definition of theocrat. And if you say a theocrat is really someone where the church rules the state. the Ayatollah or whatever's in
Right,
charge.
clerics, where clerics rule the state.
Right, and the state. Um, George Bancroft, very famous 19th century historian, I think gave us the idea that the Puritans were theocrats because he called them theocrats, and he said it's because only church members could vote. Now that only church members could vote would, go by the by after a while, but he described them that. But he otherwise, he had many views that were of the Puritans that weren't accurate, but this is one that has stuck. But I think realistically, what you have is you have a theological view here that says God has ordained the church to do ecclesiastical things and the state to do civil and secular things, but that those two institutions should work hand in glove with each other.
Right, right. So
And
sort of a
that's correct.
duality rather than a separation, but not, I mean, again, so I would have a definition of theocracy is the clergy rules, and they really didn't do that here. Look, it's not to say this was a tolerant society, because we've said a few times now, they were already thought to
Yep.
be kind of extremists and only church members could vote. But I just want to clear that up because sometimes my students, for example, were talking about theocracy and theocrats. I'm not really sure that's what they are. Okay, now, one thing that has stuck from this essay is the covenant metaphor. So I want to talk about that a little bit. Winthrop employs a covenant image to describe this new community. Here's what he said. I'm going to quote now. For the work we have in hand, it is by a mutual consent to seek out a place of cohabitation and consortship under a due form of government, both civil and ecclesiastical. And he says this is not just a covenant with each other, but with God. So I'm quoting again. Thus stands the cause between God and us. We are entered into a covenant with him for this work. We have taken out a commission. The Lord hath given us leave to draw our own articles. Now, if the Lord shall please to hear us and bring us in peace to the place we desire, then hath he ratified this covenant and sealed our commission, and will expect a strict performance of the articles contained in it. So, Don, how has this covenant metaphor, of course suitably updated, continued in American political life?
To the extent that Winthrop's image of the covenant, his description of the covenant and their mission ends up merging with later approaches to American exceptionalism. This text gives America a chance to say, back to its founding, our Puritan founding, America can say, quoting the Blues Brothers, we're on a mission from God. Okay? This is a special country chosen by God to do special things in the world. It's a very powerful image, probably as powerful now as then, because that kind of covenant and mission talk at the time was really pretty common. What I find interesting is that Winthrop really reverses what I would call the classic Old Testament covenantal approach. If you think about it, those covenants were initiated by God, and God was a lot more vocal in the Old Testament than he was in Puritan New England. And God would say, I'm going to do these things for you, he'd say to a person or a people, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. Now, as my people, here's what you got to do. So God is really, initiating the covenant, and he's setting the terms of the covenant. But in this case, Winthrop initiates the covenant, and he assumes that God has let him set the terms. Then, says Winthrop, if God actually gets us safely to New England, the covenant is deemed signed, sealed, and delivered. Basically saying, God, if you don't like this plan, you can just sink us. But if you bring us to the new world, then this is the deal. It's actually a very clever way of Winthrop telling his very religious listeners or readers that God has signed off on Winthrop and his plans and will demand strict performance of Winthrop's plans by the people. I wish I'd thought of this during my entrepreneurial days.
That is very clever. I had not thought about that actually. And Don, I also want to, so we talk about American exceptionalism continuing, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But of course, we wouldn't say it that way today. We wouldn't say quite that way. God has favored our enterprise, and therefore, we are a great nation, we're a historical nation, we matter. But we still think we're a historical nation and we matter, right? So I guess that has sort of continued, even though not everyone today would have this view. I also want to point out, Don, something else. He also talks about a covenant they have with each other. He says, the Lord hath given us leave to draw our own articles. And he talks about establishing government, both civil and ecclesiastical. So that also, I think, has continued, right? That in America, we're here by consent, and our government is by consent, and that's why it's legitimate.
And I think that resonates perhaps better than the "we're on a mission from God" part. Um, Actually, at the very beginning, in the Puritan communities, there was a church covenant that every member of the church signed. I mean, think covenant, just think agreement, think contract.
Contract.
And so there was a contract that everybody signed, and this is our deal, and then there was a town covenant that everybody signed in the town, and this is what we kind of owe to each other. And they would also have elected representatives and that sort of thing, but the basis of the community and the mutual kind of rights and obligations, again heavier on obligations than rights, were set out in these covenants. And you moved into town, you signed them if you agreed to them, and if you didn't agree to them, you didn't move into town. That is an early precursor of much of the ways we think about government, and probably a direct precursor of what any one of us who live in a community call a homeowners association.
Yeah, but not just a homeowners association agreement, but also the Constitution, right? The theory is we have all consented to this, and that's why it binds us. So, okay, let's get to the money quote now. So this is the part everybody talks about. Winthrop says towards the end of the essay, he says, "We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work. And if we do all this," he says, "then everything's going to be great. And men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it like that of New England." Okay, and now here he gets into the part everyone quotes. "For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. So that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God and all professors for God's sake. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us, till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going." Okay, so this, when I read this, again, having read it when I was in school and then having heard it all the time, this is entirely the opposite of the way we normally understand this language politically. So going back to President Reagan, John Kennedy talked this way, Barack Obama quoted this. As I said, pretty much every presidential candidate quotes this, and lots of other politicians too. It's a boast. We are a city upon a hill. We are a magnet for everyone. That's not what this is about, I think, Don. John Winthrop is not talking like that here.
Well, there's a reason they call the Puritans dour. Yes, I agree with you. Winthrop is issuing a warning. We're up on a hill. Everybody can see us. We better not screw this up, because if we do, then everybody like us will be essentially tarred with that brush, that will be shamed, and all of God's other worthy servants will be shamed. So we have to set a good example, and not because when we set a good example, we're great and everything will be great. It's if we set a bad example, everything's really going to be bad.
Right. So what happened? Because that is not how we see it. And I think it's fair to say that Americans, again, we don't necessarily have the sense of, direct responsibility to God, or at least many people don't have that any longer. And we don't have the sense that we're going to shame God if we screw it up. But we definitely have a sense we are an exceptional place, and everyone is paying attention to us, and what we do really matters. So how did this get transformed? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the actual transformation may have been in part from Ronald Reagan looking for sound bites. And he picked this up from a history of America. And he wrote down in his 3x5 cards, City on a Hill. And he ran with it. And, I've got a little of his farewell address. So
Yeah, please.
let's look at what he says. And again, compare it to what you just read from Winthrop himself. He says, lately, I've thought a bit of the shining city on a hill. It's shining now.
It changed,
Okay?
yeah.
Yeah, shining city upon a hill. The phrase comes from John Winthrop, who wrote it to describe the America he imagined. What he imagined was important because he was an early pilgrim, an early freedom man. Like the other pilgrims, he was looking for a home that would be free. I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, says Reagan, but I don't know if I've ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. Well,
it's a nice image.
You can see why they called him the great communicator and not the great fact checker. Winthrop was not a pilgrim. Those were the folks who 10 years earlier had tried America's first great attempt at socialism, which is not a likely choice for Reagan. Also, it's very hard to say that Winthrop was a freedom man, although that has been really pushed by 19th century historians like Tocqueville and George Bancroft. These Puritans, they believed in freedom. They came for freedom. Well, he banished people for criticizing either the general court or the state-funded church, or for holding their own illegal religious meetings. He took the guns away from any of the people who supported folks who had illegal religious meetings. So that crosses out pretty much everything in the first two amendments of the Bill of Rights. The idea that the Puritans were devoted to freedom is really a 19th century invention. It's now part of the origin story we talked about at the beginning, and very much a part of the shining city on a hill image. But it's really based on the false assumption that because they wanted to come here to America to be free to live their own lives, that they believed in freedom generally. They didn't believe in freedom generally. They called the idea of the liberty of conscience the back door through which Satan could come into a community.
Yeah, I see. So as I said when you were reading that, it's a nice image that Reagan has. It's a beautiful image, but it is just not the image of John Winthrop. It is something very different. And it's interesting to me how the sense of exceptionalism has continued today in America for 400 years, although it has been totally transformed. It means something very different from what it meant at the start. Don, do you have any final thoughts about this essay and what it means for America today?
Well, you've got a really resonant set of words here, particularly in the City on a Hill. Winthrop used it one way, Reagan used it another. Certainly Reagan's image of a shining city of harmony and peace has maybe not been realized fully just yet, but it has been fully resonant in our American society, especially in our political rhetoric. And I think that especially those of us who do church and state things as we do, Mark, and think about the new kind of history and tradition angle on interpreting the Constitution. So we have a tradition of the city on a hill. Which one is the right tradition? Is it the accurate version of Winthrop's warning that everybody's watching and we better do it right? Or is it the triumphant 20th century shining city on a hill where things are great? They're both, now Reagan's been gone for a long time. They're both traditions. They're both part of our tradition. But if we're talking about the American tradition, And if we're talking about how that might influence interpreting the Constitution, which one is the right one? Well,
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I mean, that's basically what we're talking about. Is it the original meaning, which is pretty clear what Winthrop's original meaning was, or is it the meaning that has evolved over time and has become a tradition? Tradition is not the same as origin, right? Tradition is that which develops from origin. So that's a fascinating question too. Well, Don, we'll have to have you come back on to discuss that, maybe specifically in connection with this new history and tradition test that the court announced in the Bremerton case, city of Bremerton case. No one knows what it means yet, and we can come back and we can talk about that. That would be fantastic. But
love to do it.
thank you, Don. But for now, let's just say that's been another episode of Legal Spirits. This is our podcast series on cases and issues in law and religion. You can find past episodes archived on our website, lawandreligionforum.org, and also on Apple iTunes and Spotify and Google and soon YouTube. So please do subscribe so that you can find out when new episodes are released. But that's it for now. See you next time.